Now for today's talk from John Borland. Delighted to welcome John along today. John retired as Measured Survey Manager from HES last year after 36 years of service with the organisation. Most of that with the predecessor organisation, Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland, and then Historic Environment Scotland. He has recorded archaeology and architecture throughout Scotland, developing a vast knowledge of the nation's story. We're delighted to welcome John along today and to benefit from his expertise. So without further ado, over to you, John, and if I could just remind everyone to remain muted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, albeit in pixelated form. On the plus side, of course, I think doing this through Zoom means that we are probably reaching out to many more people than would normally be within the catchment area of John Sinclair House in Edinburgh, so swings and roundabouts. But it's a pleasure to be with you. The first slide here, today's talk is going to be on wars on Pictish sculpture. And this talk was first put together for the Society of Church Archaeology Conference in 2018. That year, of course, was an important centenary, so the theme for the conference was the commemoration of war. Many fantastic papers at the conference looking at things like the Bayeux Tapestry, medieval grave slabs, graffiti in churches dating from the English Civil War, lots of really good stuff. But certainly chronologically, this paper was the earliest. And as the conference was in Hull, I reckoned that this was probably the first time the Picts had travelled that far south for quite a wee while. So the paper starts off with a kind of general introduction to the Picts, who, where, why, when, etc. So if some of this is very well known to a home audience, my apologies, stating the bleak obvious. And also, I should say, as Neil says, I am now retired, but the paper was put together when I was Measured Survey Manager at HES. I just haven't bothered to delete all the branding. So just so there's no confusion there. So, who were the Picts? Well, they were one of three native inhabitants of what we now call Scotland, inhabiting by far the largest area in Scotland, from the Forth north up to the Northern Isles, out to the Western Isles. Their neighbours to the west were the Scots, Gaels, with strong cultural and political, and to the south, Britons. The Britons in the south of Scotland were probably very culturally and linguistically similar to the native Britons that inhabited the southern half of Britain. We don't know much about the Pictish language, but we do know that it wasn't Gaelic or Gaelic, but it was almost certainly a Celtic language, probably similar to, akin to the Old Welsh as spoken by the Britons. I should also say that into this mix of these are the three native inhabitants, into this mix come the Anglo-Saxons from the south, from about the 6th century onwards, and then later than that, the Norse coming in from the north and taking over quite a chunk of land as well. And the Romans circumnavigated the British Isles, and they plotted and recorded all the different tribes and peoples that inhabited Scotland, gave them all names, and there's not a Picty in sight. That name doesn't appear until near the end of the 3rd century, the year 297, when this chap Eumenius is writing a panegyric. He's waxing lyrically, eulogising the emperor and the empire, how great it all is. And he has a bit of a swipe at these Picti, or painted people, living beyond Rome's northern frontier. They're not playing by the rules, they're not toeing the line, they're a bit problematic, so he has a bit go at them. So that's the first time that the name appears in an historical source. But I think we can safely assume that Eumenius hasn't coined the phrase, he's merely putting into writing for the first time a name that is probably commonly in use along the northern frontier referring to these tribes up above. But I think it's also safe to assume that by the year 297, we're not looking at a new tribal or national entity on Rome's northern border. They are still probably made up of numerous different tribes and peoples, but they're given this catch-all title. And that's how we should probably view it at this point in time. It's a catch-all and pejorative name for these untamed tribes. And Alex Wolff, I think, came up with a very good comparison by saying, think the term redskins as applied to European settlers being applied to all Native American peoples, all these different tribes and different nations, but this was a catch-all term and not a very complimentary one. So I think probably Picty or painted people is in the same vein as that. So the name Picty, painted people, what does it mean? Well, the truth is we don't actually know. It could imply that they were tattooed. We have no evidence of that. It might have been a reference to woad or war paint, although frankly the prospect of them all looking like Mel Gibson is truly frightening. But we do have this lovely little piece of evidence from the archaeological record. This is a Roman dice tower found in Germany, but given the way that the legions were moved about, it's not difficult to figure out how something was taken from the northern frontier down to the German frontier. And it's got this lovely little sort of dedication on it, which translates as "the Picts are defeated, the enemy deleted, play in safety." So who knows whether this was a one-off that somebody commissioned or got made, who was stationed on Hadrian's Wall to commemorate some great victory, or maybe some enterprising craftsman was knocking these off and selling them to legionaries along the line there. But it's a lovely little piece of evidence with the name Pict in it. It's around this time that the name Scotty or the Scots first appear in references referring to the Gaels in the west of Scotland. And this too seems to have been a less than complimentary name. There are various theories as to where the name originated from and what it meant. Pirate is one possibility, horde another, but again, it seems to be a sort of catch-all term and not a very complimentary one at that. But interestingly, these names as applied to and given to these different peoples seem to stick, they get traction. And so when the Romans depart these shores early in the 5th century, the name Pict stays on, and the post-Roman Britain, the Brythonic people, the Anglo-Saxon sources, the Scots themselves, and the Irish keep making reference to the Picts. And indeed, that tends to be our only source of reference. Nothing much really survives from the Picts themselves, but things written about them are our main source of documentary evidence. And things like the Isles of Ulster give us, it's like a sort of yearly almanac of important events that happen throughout the British Isles, and it gives us a great source of information about the Picts waging war with all of their neighbours, the Scots, the Britons of Strathclyde, the Angles of Northumbria, sometimes teaming up with somebody to go attack another person. So I think it's like a big giant game of Risk, and often warring with and amongst themselves for tribal supremacy and for the kingship. So without further ado, let's look at some of the images that we might have. The Picts themselves, as I said, left very little written evidence, but we do have this wealth of sculpture. And probably what is most iconic about them would be their symbol stones. Graphic publicity at their best. They are beautiful works of art. They tend to be labelled as enigmatic, and then because of that, the enigma ends up becoming attached to the Picts themselves. Personally, I don't mind the label being applied to the symbols, to the symbol stones, because the fact is we don't actually know what they mean. Lots of theories abide. The one that is most currently held is that they are a form of writing communicating a message, perhaps personal names, which were legible to the people who erected them, but not to us. But obviously it's not good, not helpful to then attach labels like enigmatic and mysterious to the Picts themselves. They were a mainstream late Iron Age, early historic people, culturally very similar wants, desires and fears to their near neighbours. So we shouldn't really see them as being something of a different world. They're very much part and parcel of early medieval British Isles. Upon conversion to Christianity, they cease to carve these stones solely with symbols and move instead to carve Christian monuments, sometimes with symbols incorporated. They carved a multitude of different forms, but definitely their carved stone of choice was the cross slab. They made it their own. It becomes an illustrated page in stone with a cross and then sumptuous detail and figurative carving of various themes, and a wonderful source of imagery and insight into their material culture. So let's look at the images that we have. And the first would be this, the sort of savage warrior. We've got maybe about half a dozen of these stones in Aberdeenshire, all similar in a theme, depicting more often than not a naked warrior. So it's maybe not overly clear here, but if I use my cursor, we can see a pair of naked legs and feet down here, thigh, a buttock, and then there's a rectangular shield coming in here, arm and shoulder. There's the nape of the neck and the rounded head, eye, prominent nose, big nose there, and his lug, and then in the other arm, this incised line running up here, he's holding his leaf blade end to the spear. Many scholars, probably most scholars, don't put these type of stones into the same category as Pictish symbol stones. They're certainly working on a different level and imparting a different message, but they are very definitely Pictish. We find them in the Pictish heartland, and they are symbolic because they are so close. The ones that moved from Perthshire, Fife, Angus, Aberdeenshire, they are so similar in style that they are certainly symbolic, but it seems that they're not accepted as part of the symbol language. They're imparting a different message, some kind of tribal boundary perhaps, who knows. This one's from Killessie in Fife. Fairly recently, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, this new one turned up during the roadworks just on the west side of Perthshire, of Perth rather, at a place called Tulloch. And it's another one following the same theme. The carving is partly eroded and abraded, but again we can see a generous bottom, let's say, here, then a bit of damage to the stone, but picking up to the nape of the neck, the head. He seems to, it's either a strange hairstyle or maybe a cap or helmet. Ear, eye, again a prominent nose, and then this arm coming down here and holding a lovely leaf-shaped terminal or blade to the spear, but on the other end we have this ball terminal, and here are enlarged details, and I'll just bring out the outline of those. There is some good documentary evidence, I believe, of, I think it's Roman, of the Romans encountering natives in sort of Iron Age might have been Britannia, but it might have been Gaul, using this weapon with this ball end on the spear. So the spear quality to it, but the heavy ball at the other end is swung up under somebody's chin, so that's very much acting as a weapon as well. But very beautiful example, this, and I'm sure it will get prominence in the new Perth Museum when it opens up, hopefully quite soon. Similar but different is the famous Ridgeway man. This was found in the 1990s, just below the now excavated building and palisaded settlement at Ridgeway. Fabulous, full of character, again, very, very prominent beaky nose, teeth sharpened to a point, and this sort of either a headdress or long hair, but with a bald top to it, and with a quite a fine-hafted axe swung over his shoulder, and beautifully observed hands with the thumbs grasping that haft. Whether this is a depiction of a warrior, a god, a devil, a bogeyman, that's up for debate, but it's a superb and characterful piece of carving. More often than not, on Pictish cross slabs, the figures that we see are probably not shown as being probably more associated with the hunt, but it gives us a good idea of what a Pictish nobleman and Pictish warrior would look like. And zooming into this this one from Kirriemuir, the detail is fabulous and beautifully preserved. We've got all that saddlecloth and all the horse furniture, all his garb, whether it's pleated or quilted or striped, but a great depiction of it. Weapons there, we have the sword in its scabbard, we have the spear. I love even the plaited beard here. It's like a Mr. Whippy cone with that spiral plait on it, beautiful. And note also, just over his shoulder here, we have a Pictish symbol, now somewhat debased. This is what's called a double disc in Z-rod, but the Z-rod has lost most of its angular quality and it now looks like a stick of celery. Again, that's something that happens with the symbols. They make their way onto the cross slabs, but through time they lose that graphic quality and clarity and become something totally different. But a beautiful example of what a Pictish noble might have looked at if he'd ridden out to war. And if all this nobility, oh, sorry, I've got another one here. This is a little tiny slab from Meagle. Similar, again, we've got an incised spear and spear tip coming down on the far side of him, and we've got his sword in the scabbard. Beautiful shoes, or perhaps some people have speculated it might be some form of stirrup that was attached to the saddlecloth, but I think more likely just to be shoes. But note the little detail here on his sword scabbard, that rounded terminal, the chape, and again we've got a nice example of that coming up with fabulous animal terminal heads from St Ninian's Island, Shetland. So pretty good indication that what we are seeing in these carved stones in the sculpture is a depiction of their material culture. And from that, I think we can probably, that's quite a useful indicator of the veracity of the detail that we're being shown. And if all of this nobility is beginning to wear a bit thin here, we've got this lovely one from St Vigins with the little crossbow man down here. So again, a hunting scene rather than somebody going to war, but very definitely showing a crossbow. We can see the bolt outlined against the stock. And again, his hand isn't holding the bow, he's holding at the end of the stock, the trigger mechanism and the crossbow string itself. I think the crossbow is known as a late Roman weapon. It doesn't really become common weapon until much later in the medieval period, but this would be some indication of some of those late Roman weapons perhaps surviving, or the technology surviving to make them. And there is something in the archaeological record, part of the trigger mechanism and the bolt heads of crossbow bolts from Crannog in Ayrshire, dated to the 8th century. Someone more recently has told me that the veracity of that dating is questionable, so it may be that it's not entirely clear, but ostensibly, potentially, we are looking at some evidence of crossbows in the late medieval period. And then on the fabulous Duplin cross, we've got this lovely depiction of the warrior king. By this late time, some of the figurative carvings becoming slightly caricaturish, and I'm not really sure what this feature is here. It looks as if it would be the end of a spear, but then nothing is really surviving or visible. Maybe the hint of a end of a spear there. It does look a little bit like a scarf blowing in the wind as he's trotting along. But almost certainly here we've got the image of a king on the other side of the cross. The first 3 lines of an inscription can be translated as Constantine, son of Fergus, and he's a Pictish king who died in 820. So whether this is commissioned to commemorate him in his lifetime or upon his death, that gives us a rough idea. Ballpark figure to date, this fabulous cross. And we'll come back to this one later on for some other relevant imagery. Also on the sides of the shaft of the cross, we've got these images of kind of visual images referring to King David, the biblical King David. He's the king to be associated with. He's a warrior, he's fearless, he's a defender of his flock. He's a poet and a musician, but also importantly, he was anointed by God to become king. So that's an important connection that various kings thereafter want to be associated with, that sort of holy claim to a throne. And the antithesis of all this nobility, we have this fabulous figure on bullion stone from Angus. This was found in the 1960s, I think, when they were putting in the Kingsway, the sort of dual carriage that bypasses round the north side of Dundee. Fabulous character, very comical. The fact that it's sort of like meandering uphill, the horse is on remote control, it knows the way home, whilst he is quaffing deeply from his drinking horn. And just to add to the comedy, the drinking horn has a bird head terminal which is looking back at him. So if this is commemorating somebody in their life or somebody after the death, it's certainly got a tongue-in-cheek approach to it. We do have some nice evidence of bird head terminals from drinking horns. These are Norse ones, but again, it shows that what we're looking at here in terms of the material culture is reliable. Going back then to the Duplin cross and armed soldiers with spears and round shields. And this is about the only time that we see Pictish soldiers, Pictish figures, Pictish warriors who are not bareheaded. They're nearly always shown with a bare head, long hair, but these guys seem to have something on their head, whether it's a helmet or a cowl. It's difficult to say, but they certainly seem to have something on them. This line of 4 figures appears on other sides around the cross shaft. So again, the implication is that these are the armed forces that Constantine has at his command, representation of his army. Similarly, as a sort of army on parade, there was a royal guard. We've got this lovely little array of people from the. This is probably, it's very fragmentary, and it is probably, I reckon, a cross slab. We've just lost all of the carving on the other side. It's sheared into a sliver. So what we have is this amount of the side with the Pictish symbols and the three figures. Zooming into the three figures, though, again, lots of lovely detail with scabbards, again, with a hint of a rounded shape. The shields, square shields here. And again, here, what is passing perhaps as decoration might actually represent the rivets of the handle through which you would pass your arm to hold the spear on the inside. But note that the leading figure, presumably the noble or the king here, slightly higher up, maybe slightly larger, and certainly lots more detail, a fancy curly hairdo, a much longer sumptuous beard, lots of ornamentation on his shield. So good source of information about perhaps a Pictish noble or king, an armed guard that he would have at his command, the weapons and the kit that they would have, but also a good indication here of hierarchy is in Pictish sculpture, and that's something we will see as we go on. Than others, they're usually shown with more detail and more ornament than the other people. It's part and parcel of creating that visual hierarchy on the stone. We have a similar little array and parade of people on the cross slab from Issy in Aegis. Another beautiful cross slab there and on. I'm reluctant to see the back. I know that upsets some people who don't like to see the side with the symbols being referred to as the back. There's an assumption that the cross is the front. Personally, I think on a Christian piece of sculpture, I don't have a problem calling cross side the front. I'm sure symbolically this was the important message here. So anyway, the back, the reverse on the other side, we've got these three figures, not as much detail surviving or indicated on as on the Broffa stone, but very definitely a hierarchy in size. The leading figure is larger, the curl of his hair is a bit more ornate, and whereas these two figures at the rear have incised linear spears, his spear is carved in relief, so a little bit more prominence to it, and he's certainly a good half a head taller than the others. So again, hierarchy there. And this time they seem to be wearing capes. We've got another array on the large cross slab from Phil's Wester in Perthshire. This is quite an amazing cross slab, sadly very eroded and worn, but lots of amazing detail, lots of stuff that's so far gone that it's now quite uncertain in terms of what it is. But the bit that interests us is we have this person leading a bull or an ox with a bell around its neck, so perhaps some kind of scriptural reference going on here, or perhaps just something going to the slaughter as part of a feast or something like that. But behind him, this honour guard of men marching, and again we've got this thing of them now overlapping so that room to show them all walking in a line, overlapping them like this. We can get that array in. Once again, we've got square shields with a hint of a central boss on the one that we can see fully. Swords by their side, they're carrying spears, they're bearded, they're wearing tunics, and interestingly, although it's not overly evident on the men, we can see for the first time at the angle of his feet here, and we get a hint of it with these other ones with the angle of the legs to the back of each person, an intimation of movement. Up till now, all the people we've seen, if I just scroll back a wee bit, all the people we've seen in a line, but there's no attempt to show movement. The feet are flat on the ground. But with this one, we've got an intimation of movement, so a little bit of sophistication creeping into the sculptural depiction here. But again, we have this, as I say, this honour guard, this army on parade. Lovely little fragment from Kinether, now in Elgin Museum. Shows a sort of army on manoeuvre, an army moving out. We've got horsemen all look like they're moving apace, and then below them lines of footmen, soldiers presumably, although the stone is quite badly weathered, so there's not much detail to discern here in terms of their weaponry. But we have a similar theme, one from Dull in Perthshire. So again, it looks like an army on manoeuvres. We've got armed horsemen, spears, shields, and armed foot soldiers with shields and nice tunic detail. And note also, when we saw the Pictish noble for the hunting scene on the Kirriemuir cross slab, with the hunting scenes, we see hunting hounds. We've got things that are much more like terriers here. And that's something that crops up on one or two stones. So maybe these were actually used in some kind of military way, or maybe they're just pets that accompany the army on the go. But certainly, they're not hunting dogs for sure. Something smaller and bitier, perhaps. The cross slab from Glam's manse, now quite difficult to get in to see, now that the manse is no longer a functioning manse. We've got this nice depiction of hand-to-hand combat going on here. They're kind of wrestling with each other, grappling and swinging hatchets. Again, not sure what the theme would be, whether it's some sort of biblical homily or something from Pictish myth and legend. Not at all sure, but note above these pair of fighting axemen here, we have a cauldron on a stand, and projecting from out of the top of the cauldron are two pairs of legs. So again, some kind of moral story being shown here as to some nasty fate that awaits somebody. Definitely are more likely to be a biblical scene here. We've got the Inchbrayock, one of the Inchbrayock stones from Angus. We've got a depiction of what might be Samson brandishing the jawbone of an ass as his weapon of choice. He seems to be threatening a cleric or a monk with it, who's tonsured with a hood there. But I love the fact that whoever was carving this decided that the teeth had to be at that side to be more threatening, whereas of course the teeth would actually be along this side of the jawbone. So a little bit of artistic license there just to add to the drama. But now we come to our actual war and armies at war and battle scenes, and the obvious first call would be the Aberlemno cross slab, the one in the kirkyard there, with its very famous battle scene on the back, reverse, other side. But who's fighting? One army, those on the left, are bareheaded. See, we've got long hair, long hair, long hair. And the Picts are almost always portrayed bareheaded in their sculpture. The only exception would be those armed figures on the Dublin cross shaft. The other army, the ones on the right, are wearing very distinctive helmets with a nose guard and a bit coming round over the rear. Very distinctive. And we can identify something very close to that in the archaeological record. This is the Anglo-Saxon, Anglian Coppergate helmet from York, which is remarkably similar with its prominent nose piece and the sort of cheek guards here as to what's shown on the sculpture. there is another carving contemporary, the Frank's casket, a little carved, I think, whalebone casket, piece of Anglo-Saxon art. And again, the soldiers here are wearing very similar helmets to those shown on there. So perhaps we are looking at, yeah, there we go, we're just highlighting that similarity there. So perhaps we are looking at the Picts fighting the Anglo-Saxons, and perhaps more accurately, the Angles of Northumberland. And because of that, and because of the proximity of Aberlemno to a place called Dunnichen, there is a general acceptance by many people that this carving is commemorating and depicting the Battle of Dunnichen, fought in the year 685. Now, Dunnichen was a fairly important and pivotal victory for the Picts. Up until then, the Angles of Northumberland, this grey area here, would be their original kingdom, but by 685 they had pushed their way up into much of central eastern Scotland and out towards Galloway as well, hemming in the Britons of Strathclyde into this area, the Kingdom of Alclute, and constantly pushing north into Pictish territory. And so the Battle of Dunnichen, they are soundly defeated, their king and his sons are killed, and this once and for all puts an end to their expansionist ploys north up into Pictland. So it's a very, very pivotal battle in Pictish history. And so most people, or many people, believe that that's what we're looking at commemorated here. We'll come back to the matter of whether it is or isn't a little bit later on. So, Battle of Dunnichen 685. Bede, writing about it, says that King Ecgfrith is rashly leading his army into the province of the Picts, and that the enemy made a show to flee, and the king was drawn into the narrows of inaccessible mountains and slain with the greatest part of his force. Annals of Ulster are a little bit more factual and a little bit less flowery, but they just tell us that on Saturday, May the 20th, 685, King Ecgfrith, son of Oswy, who was king of the Saxons, had reigned for 15 years, was slain with a great body of his soldiers by Bridie, son of Beli, king of Fort True. So it may well be that this is what's been commemorated here. It has to be said, I know scholars who don't even buy into the fact that these are Anglo-Saxon helmets, that they would say that this is just a sculptural device, a pictorial device to separate winners from losers, one side from the other. You pays your money, you takes your choice. Personally, I think the closeness of what's shown here to what's shown on the Frank's casket and the actual archaeological evidence of the Cobham Gate helmet, I think it's more likely that we are looking at. But whether it's Dunnichen or not, I'm less persuaded. But back to the battle scene, what we're looking at here is not a tableau of a battle, but a storyboard. There are no horizontal divisions, but the story reads from top to bottom, from left to right, in 3 distinct registers. And the 2 opposing sides aren't just differentiated by the presence or absence of helmets. Each side occupies the same side of the battlefield, the Picts on the left, the enemy, whoever they may be, on the right. So looking at the first register, we see the Pictish cavalry coming in from the left and repelling the Anglo-Saxon cavalry. I'll call them that because that's my belief of what they are. Note the discarded weapons, shield, sword, etc. So this is the first register of the storyboard, and right from the beginning, the battle is going in favour of the Picts of the home team. It's never in question, it's never touch and go, it's never a matter of it could swing either way. So in that sense, I think we're looking at if whatever historical event this is commemorating, we're also looking at a piece of propaganda here that the winning side, it was never in doubt that they were going to win. Next register, we've got Pictish infantry repelling Anglo-Saxon cavalry. Note the swordsman at the front of the line here. He's been defended by spearmen at the back. And note also that the shields, he's carrying his shield, but we have an incised line of a strap going over his shoulder. Shield is strung over his shoulder with an incised line to allow him both hands free to work his spear. So again, lots of detail going on here. And then the final line of the storyboard, the Pictish cavalry and the Anglo-Saxon cavalry confront each other, but we end with the body of a dead Anglo-Saxon. He's got a spear lodged in his head and a raven symbolically is pecking at his dead body. So it's a victory for the Picts, for the home team, and a symbolic death and defeat for the others. So could these two horsemen here be King Bridie and King Igfrith? Could this be the body of the dead Anglo-Saxon king now carrying for the ravens? Possibly. But if we remember our examples that we saw earlier of the hierarchy with either a larger size for the important ornament in their kit and more sumptuous sort of finery, larger size, we don't really have that. These two horsemen are no bigger, no different in their detail from the figures that we saw further up. It's true that, it's true that this dead figure is larger than most, so that could be an indication that he is the king, but it could also just be a compositional device to fill all of this space symbolically with a dead person of the vanquished foe. Returning to the matter of whether it is Dunnichen or not, in more recent years, Alex Wolff proposed that the battle may have actually been fought up here, now near Aviemore, sort of on the A9 at a place called Dunnichen, which again would relocate the Kingdom of Fortrue from down here to up here. And I have to say, it seems to be many scholars now have gone along with this proposition and see this as being the sort of prominent and preeminent Pictish Kingdom of Fortrue up along the Murray and the Black Isle sort of area. And certainly, if we go with Bede's description of Igfrith being drawn into the narrows of the mountain and inaccessible mountains, that works fine for the pier up the A9, work for the rolling hills of Angus down here at all. So you pays your money, you takes your choice. Our final example that we're going to look at today is the fabulous and uber impressive Swano stone up in Murray. Slightly frustrating because I have now virtually drawn all of this and have images showing the battle scene in much clearer than tends to come out in the photography, but last year's lockdown, they remain as yet unscanned and inaccessible. Someday in the not too distant future, I will get them scanned and they'll be on Canmore at the very least. So one side, this cross slab is the biggest, 6.5 meters high. On one side, we have this fabulous cross filled with and flanked with acres of interlace. You want the definition of patience, it's drawing all of that. At the bottom of it, we have slightly strange scene, but it being interpreted, I think, as perhaps a royal anointment of a king in here by bishops. But on the back, we have this amazing tableau, or again, a storyboard of a battle scene. But unlike Aberlemno, neither side has a distinguishing characteristic. We can't discern helmeted and unhelmeted soldiers here, so we have to try and find a way of figuring out who is who. but I think it is still possible that we can tell them apart. And that's by the kind of direction of movement. So the victors, we'll call them the home team, come in from the right, always. And the enemy, the people who are eventually defeated, either come in from or retreat to the left. Mostly, there's a little bit further down where we go in for symmetry, and that then throws this idea out. But for the most part, we've got this directionality that we can use to tell the two sides apart. So again, the top, it's very badly eroded and worn, and photography from the ground isn't great. But take my word for it, here we've got at least 3 rows of horsemen. The lowest of the 3 is probably the most easily discerned: horse's head, rider, legs, again and again. So 3 horsemen and 3 horsemen, and again I think 3 horsemen. And interestingly, I think it's on this register, it might be there. My survey drawing has recorded a small dog. So like that little fragment from Dull, we've got a little yappy dog going to war with its master. Not a hound, not some great big lolloping thing that's going to bring somebody down with a single bound, but some little small terrier that might be employed to nip his ankles or something, I don't know. So at least 3 rows of horsemen, and they're advancing right from the right, going to the left. So these are the home team coming into the battlefield. Below them, we have 5 armed men facing forwards, swords raised, and the central figure is slightly larger, his head is bigger, and we've got a lot more detail. The tour guides, I loved listening out to them when I was standing in the glass box drawing this, describing it that he's wearing a kilt, because it does look like a pleated kilt. I don't think we should see it, but it's pleats or pattern indicated on his garb. More detail, he's important. So perhaps he is their warrior king, flanked by his generals, standing there. They've now arrived at the battlefield, and he is readying his troops. And in the next register, battle commences. So we've got the home team, the victors, coming in from this side, and at the front man is engaging in combat with the front man of the enemy, and is already striking a blow to his head. That's his sword through there and emerging out the other side of the head. So again, like the Aberlemno storyboard, from the get-go, the battle's only going one way. The guys that win were always going to win. There's no question about it. Behind him, who's just had his head sliced in 2, is another soldier facing the enemy. But then behind him, the 2 remaining figures of the enemy side, of the people who are defeated, the vanquished, they've already turned and are now facing to run away. So again, another little bit of propaganda. As soon as things get going, somebody dies and they start to run away. Only ever going one way. Yeah, there we go. That's those guys running to the left. Below that, we have this tower or broch-like feature in the centre of the storm. Up for debate as to what is shown here, a fortification. We're really too late for it to be a broch, a round tower for a church. Lots of different ideas afloat. But to the left of that, we have a line of dead bodies without heads. The heads have been severed and their arms appear to be tied. Their arms come down and hands meet in the middle here. So maybe suggesting execution. The tower itself, if we call it that, is flanked by spearmen. So again, presumably the good guys, the victors, the Picts. But around the bottom of this tower is a cluster of severed heads belonging to these figures here. So again, we're maybe looking at ritual execution. And that's at the cluster of heads. Just out of interest, This excavation at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset in 2009 found a mass grave of dead Vikings, jumbled skeletons and bodies thrown in, but notice that the heads are not in amongst this jumble, they are all over here. So execution or beheading, either killing them as an execution or post-mortem, is certainly something that is going on at the time. And maybe this is common practice for any victorious side against the vanquished foe, or maybe this is an indication that we are looking at a Christian Pictish, Picto-Scottish army fighting a pagan Viking army, and this is something that's been visited onto pagan. Yeah, we've got the broch, in inverted commas, the tower surrounded by home team infantry armed with spears, and then below them we've got more infantry advancing, and behind them 3 trumpeters. They've got their trumpets raised and they're blowing merry hell, presumably to strike fear into the heart of their foe. And then here we've got a little bit of symmetry. We've got 2 pairs of men in hand-to-hand combat, and in each case the person on the right, this guy and this guy, is severing the head of the guy on the left. So again, I think we can presume that this is the victorious Pict chopping the head off a defeated enemy. And that's, yeah. So the battle continues to go in favour of the home team without any doubt. Below this, we've got the home team's archers advancing to the right, supported by infantry with swords and shields. And to the left of them, the enemy cavalry have turned and are fleeing the field. So once again, it's all going one way. Next, we've got this strange arched structure down here, perhaps a bridge, something like that. And below it, more headless bodies, another circle of severed heads, and one severed head boxed separately here. So structure could be a bridge, or perhaps a shingled roof, similar to, this is the one from the Book of Kells. There certainly is some kind of textural or potentially textural detail going on in here that could be shingles. So if it was a roof, then the rectangle that's formed by the dead bodies perhaps symbolises the space of a building. Who knows? On either side of this, again, we go to a bit of symmetry, and we've got foot soldiers here tackling horses. So perhaps the horses now unmanned of defeated cavalry, and then a mirror image of that, 2 men here tackling horses on that sense. So yeah, I would say that this is perhaps, we can still discern who's been victorious and who's been defeated, although we've lost that left-right directionality. And then below that, more hand-to-hand combat going on, again with lots of heads being severed and lots of blows to heads. I was quite excited when I was first working on this, because I thought I had perhaps detected a conical helmet on this chappie here, something a bit Norse looking. But in fact, what it is the tip of the sword. So his sword is now passing through his head, and it's the tip of the sword that appears, and again here, to give it the appearance of a conical helmet. So although again we've lost directionality, I think probably the victors are always going to be, the Picts are always going to be the victors and the enemy the vanquished. And again, the same going on in here with heads being decapitated and severed in battle. And then the final register of the image here, we've got the good guys, the victors, the Picts coming in from this direction, and at the front of them, so we've got swords and shields. At the front of them, their leader has just delivered a blow which has taken the head off his enemy. Interestingly, he seems to be wearing something on his head. All the other heads are just head-shaped with hair, but his is definitely rectangular. Definitely wearing something there, whether that's a crown. It's maybe a bit early for kings to be wearing crowns. A helmet, but it's something differentiating him out from the others as being someone of significance. So he's taken the head off the front man of the enemy, and the other 3 enemy spearmen have lowered their spears and are fleeing the field. Yeah, so it's definitely a piece of propaganda, but who's fighting? Well, opinions are divided. It could be a victorious Kenneth MacAlpin or one of his successors consolidating his rule over the Picts by defeating some Pictish army who didn't want to accept his rule or his dynasty. That's a possibility. Others have speculated that it could be King Du. He was known to be a bit on the evil side, I think employing black magic or something, and the legend goes that his head, when he's overthrown, his head is severed and put under a bridge. And so again, that ties in with this arch-like structure down here and the head in the box, perhaps. And this is my particular favourite, I think it is probably the Picts or the Picto-Scots being victorious over the Norse. I think the Murray Coast was certainly part of the front line against an expansive Norse settlement that was probably in control of the Northern Isles, Caithness, Sutherland, Easter Ross, much of Wester Ross, and I think the rich lands on the Murray Coast were probably a prize that attracted a lot of their attention. So my favourite, but like all the other occasions, you pay your money, you take your choice. Someone described Swinnerstone as a cenotaph to honour the dead, but I don't think it is. I think it's more like Trajan's column. I think it's a celebration of a victory. I think it says loudly and proudly, whoever the 2 sides were, I think the victors are saying, we kicked their ass. And I think that's the message, loud and clear, rather than some war cenotaph to the fallen in battle. Thank you very much. Very happy to take questions.